All right, next up, we want to talk about energy flow. So energy flow is how the energy is going to flow through a given ecosystem. A lot of times we're going to look at this by looking at a food web. Food web is a diagram that describes the trophic or feeding relationships. So here we have a food web. The food web is going to begin with our oak tree and our grass. The caterpillars are going to eat the oak leaves, the mice, rabbits, and deer eat the leaves and grass at or around on the ground. Birds, chipmunks, and mice are going to feed on seeds and nuts, but they are omnivores because they can also feed on the caterpillars who are feeding on the grass and leaves. So these herbivores and omnivores are then food for a number of different carnivores. In the grazing food web, we might find a specific grazing food chain. So you could start off with our leaves, then we go to our caterpillars, then we go to our, we don't have mice on this diagram, we have mice over here. But we could go from our leaves to caterpillars to mice to hawks. We could also go from leaves to mice to birds to hawks. We could go from leaves to deer. We could go from leaves to rabbits to foxes. Or we could go from leaves to mice, and from those mice then to hawks. I'm not sure why we don't have a hawk eating a mouse, but that should be also included in this food web. So that's going to be our food web. It's sort of this, it shows all the different relationships of all the different trophic levels of the different organisms. In the detrital food web, we might find a detrital food chain, meaning that detritus is simply dead organic matter. This could be eaten by dead organic matter. So we could have those plants die. Those could then be eaten by the earthworms. The earthworms could be eaten by the beetles. The beetles could be eaten by shrews. Shrews could then be eaten by hawks. We could see that the detritus could be eaten by so we have the detritus being eaten by the invertebrates, or those earthworms, beetles, salamanders. That salamander could then be eaten by the fox. So that's our detrital food web. Any of these organisms could then die and then be taken up as detritus. When that fox dies, he's going to become detritus, which can then be broken down by those invertebrates yet again. So trophic levels. Trophic levels are composed of all the organisms that feed at that particular link in the food chain or feed on that particular level. So in one grazing food web, the trees, the grass, the flowers, those are all producers. That's going to be our very first trophic level. The first series of animals are primary consumers. That's our second trophic level. Primary consumers eat producers. So that would be anything that eats the trees, grass, and flowers would be a primary consumer. The next group of animals would be our secondary consumers. That's our third trophic level. Those are going to be the carnivores, those that eat the herbivores. So here's an example of kind of what that looks like. We have our producers, our herbivores, our carnivores, our top carnivores, or we have our producers, our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, and our tertiary consumers. Here on our producer level, we're going to find all of our producers. So anything that can photosynthesize, plants and algae. On our second level, we'll find our herbivores, anything that eats the producers. So here is where we're going to find our primary consumers. Primary consumers would be things like herbivores, omnivores, because omnivores can feed on multiple trophic levels, omnivores, or our decomposers. Our decomposers cannot produce their own food, but they can break down those plants. They can break down those dead leaves when all those leaves start to fall down and rot. Those are going to be eaten by the detrivores. So we're going to see our our first level is going to be our producers. Then we have our primary consumers. Primary consumers are things like herbivores, omnivores, and decomposers. Our next level, our third trophic level, is going to be our carnivores, this third trophic level is going to be our secondary producers. Anybody who eats a primary, this is going to be our secondary consumers. These are going to be anybody who eats our primary consumers. So these would be things like carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers. One thing that I'd like to point out is only 10% of the energy of one trophic level is going to be available at the next trophic level. So for example, if an herbivore population consumes 1,000 kilograms of plant material, only about 100 kilograms is going to be converted to herbivore tissue. Only 10 kilograms to the first level carnivores, and 1 kilogram to the second level carnivores. This general 10% rule explains why there are so few carnivores that can be supported in a food web. If you go back to our food web over here, you're going to see that while we have lots and lots of producers, we have a ton of producers. We have all this grass, all of these plants, all of these trees. We're going to have much fewer insects than we are going to have blades of grass. We're going to have much fewer birds that feed on the insects than we are going to have insects, and we're going to have even fewer hawks. This environment, all these producers cannot actually support very many hawks in a given population because so little energy is actually going to make it to the hawk. 90% of the energy is going to be lost between the producers and the primary consumers. Another 90% is going to be lost again between the primary consumers and the secondary consumers, and an additional 90% is going to be lost yet again to the tertiary consumers. So we're going to see significantly fewer tertiary consumers or top carnivores in any given ecosystem because they simply cannot be supported on the amount of energy that's available to them at that trophic level. An ecological pyramid just shows the flow of energy with large losses between successive trophic levels. We started off with a very large producer base, have a smaller primary consumer base, an even smaller secondary consumer base, and a really tiny tertiary consumer base. All right, so you should be able to explain the differences between grazing food webs and a detrital food web and give an example of each. You should also know what is meant by each of those different trophic levels. And you should also be very familiar with those trophic levels and know where each organism exists on the trophic level. Where are producers found? Where are consumers found? Herbivores. Are herbivores producers, primary consumers, or secondary consumers? Are omnivores? Where are omnivores going to be found on those trophic levels? So I want you to be very familiar with those different trophic levels and where all of the different organisms would be found on those trophic levels. All right, and that'll be it for this section. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.